I'd like to introduce Kushanava Choudhury. Kushanava Choudhury is the writer of the epic city, The World and the Streets of Calcutta, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2017. I was in Calcutta a few months ago and happened to read Epic City. The Guardian newspaper gave it a review saying it was witty, polished, honest, and insightful. It was all those things as well as a book that explored identity, belonging. It had many things resounding in my head while I was reading it. I loved the book, and when I read it, I instinctively felt that I'd like to interview Kushanava to know more about the stories that have influenced him. Kushanava has worked as an academic and a journalist in India and in the US. He's currently in Princeton. Most recently, he was the Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. He spent much of the last decade living in India and is currently working on a book about what he witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic in New Delhi and how it changed him. Those are the operative words here, how it changed him. I'm curious to know more. So thank you so very much, Kushanava, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for those kind words.
More than kind, far more than kind. I meant every word of it. But, even before we talk about your experiences of COVID-19 and how it changed you and so on, let's just try and think about those words. We're talking about stories seldom told. We're talking about our own unconscious biases. And I'm just wondering what you understand by, unconscious bias. What does that even mean to you?
Well, I think unconscious bias is this set of blinders that we have with which we go through the world. And we all have them, but we're not aware of them. We just accept that the way we see the world is real. But the way we see the world is really, it's constructed, it's made up of certain stories that we have about the world. And those stories change, and they can be changed. And it's very interesting to be a writer because we are in the business of telling stories. And then to move around in the world and see that everybody is a writer in some way because everybody's telling a kind of story. They're just not maybe as conscious of the stories that they tell themselves, the scripts that they have, as others.
It makes sense because I often I wouldn't choose the words that you chose, and I think that it makes sense. It's stories, and our podcast is called Stories Seldom Told. So I'm glad you've used that word. But I often think about the fact that we all create our own reality, don't we?
That's right. Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. We're saying these things in our head, and we're just creating our own stories to live our lives the best way we can.
Yeah.
But yeah. So tell us more. Because in my introduction of you said that you're writing a book and how it's changed you, and that you were locked down in Delhi. Coincidentally, I was locked down in Delhi too at the same time. Little did we know each other. I had come across your book at that point, but we were both in the same city at the same time, where the whole country closed its borders in March 2020, and whether you liked it or not, you couldn't leave.
You couldn't leave.
It's a positive, pleasurable experience for me, as I suspect it may well have been for you. But tell me more, Kushanava. Stories. Share a story with us.
Sure. I mean, maybe I can start a little bit before the pandemic. So you mentioned that I had written this book about Calcutta, and when I had written the book, one of the things that I was very interested in is the history of the city, the modern history of the city, the history of partition, the history of the Naxalite movement, the left movements, the things that I had seen forming the sort of generations before me, and that I didn't know that much about. I knew about the Bengal famine as something which had happened. I had read about the Bengal famine, and when I would interview people, it would come up in conversations. The Bengal famine, for those who don't know, is this man-made famine that happened in the Second World War, when the price of rice rose 8-10-fold and then disappeared from the market. It was driven by the wartime demand for rice and indeed a great deal of things, and then about 3 million people, estimated 3 million people out of 60 million people in Bengal, starved. And nobody was ever found responsible for this. So this has been written about, and we know about it, but there are no museums to the Bengal famine. There is no memorials to the Bengal famine, and it's one of those things that we knew about but didn't know much about. We knew and didn't know, and so um, I mentioned it in the book, but there's not much more about it. When I was writing the book, I was much more interested in the stories of my family, which had to do with partition, because we became refugees, and that was something I grew up with. Uh, when I was living in Delhi, I had this very interesting experience that, I went back to Calcutta once to visit, and I found a little magazine, a Bengali little magazine, where they had published an issue on the Bengal famine. And in that issue, there were 16 interviews of people who were witnesses of the famine, who were still alive. They had their photographs and testimonies. And these are people in the 90s. The oldest person was 112 years old. And I just could not believe that these people were alive to tell the stories. And the stories that they told were unbelievable stories. These are just ordinary people who were farmers in the countryside, and what happened when the rice disappeared, what they did, how they sold house and home, fled for their lives. Many of them went into the jungles in the Sunderbans where the tigers live. And when I read those stories, I really did not want to read them, because in a way that they were shocking to me, but in another way they were stories I wish did not exist, because the fact that they existed meant that there were tens, hundreds, thousands of people who were out there who had stories to tell, who had simply not been asked. And one of the people who had not asked them was me. I wrote a book about Calcutta, which you read. Stories about the famine would come up tangentially in other kind of interviews, about partition, about the labor unions. People would talk about their childhood experience of the famine, but I never followed it up because it had nothing to do with my, kind of family history. It was very difficult for me to have those stories kind of haunted me for a long time. I sat with that. I started talking to friends about it. I really didn't want them to exist, honestly speaking.
But I want to understand a little bit more about that sentence you just said, that you didn't want them to exist. Because certainly, Epic City, as you correctly said, was about your story, your parents, because they were born and brought up in what is now Bangladesh. Or
my grandmother,
grandparents, not
yes,
your parents, yeah.
yes,
And
yes.
so in 1947, and their story of being refugee in what is today West Bengal, when there was partition, when you briefly mentioned partition, I just want to remind the listeners of that history lesson before we go backwards still to 1941. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Bengal famine was 41, 42?
40, yeah, basically from 42, they say 43, but really it's 42 to 44. Yeah, that period during the war. Yeah.
End of the World War II,
Yeah.
where India was still part of the British Empire, and
that's right. Yeah.
and food was being taken for the war effort, which is why they were people literally dropping like flies. But what you're saying is, I didn't want to. What does that mean? What's going on in your head at this point?
Because I thought, I mean, as you mentioned, the partition was not really a part of our kind of public remembered history either. There are no partition museums. There's no partition memorial, but it's mentioned in passing in our history books. We celebrate independence, but in my family, as in many families, the experience of independence was homelessness, right? It was to become free as a country meant to lose your country, your desh, the place that you knew your whole life as your home. That was not the story that was publicly told, but it was a story that was privately told because that was the experience that my grandmother had. And so I grew up with those stories. I was very connected to that. Our fate as a family, what we had lost, both in terms of memory, but also in terms of class. There was a huge decline because they had land there, they were property, they were well off. And then they became refugees in Calcutta, and this is a story that's very common among refugee families all over India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So that was part of my story, and that was a story that I explore in, and not just my family story, but the story of others and how it shaped the city of Calcutta. Calcutta grew in those 5 years after partition as much as it had in the previous 50 years. So yeah, I guess what was interesting about the issue of the famine is the famine happened just before partition in the Second World War. So it was just a few years before, and it was an enormous event. It is comparable to what happened in Europe, in Poland, and in Ukraine, Belarus. In the Holocaust, the mass killing of large numbers of people, not with concentration camps and not with bullets, but with hunger. But I didn't explore it in large part, I think, because it was not a story that had anything directly to do with me. So no one in my family starved in the Bengal famine. No one in the families of anybody I knew starved in the Bengal famine. Partition was a story that was very common among my friends' families, in the families of my parents' friends. There were many partition families, but I didn't know anybody who had a relative who had starved in the Bengal famine, or who had lost a relative in the Bengal famine from disease. I had only heard stories of other people coming to the city of Calcutta and begging for food, right? And I think that had something to do with why I knew and didn't know about it, why I chose to not look into those.
Why? Because there's no personal story, because this is not. Are you feeling that you're an interloper, that this is not your story to tell? What was it that's holding you back? I'm still not understanding that.
There was nothing holding me back. I think when I saw the stories, what I realized was that you have to think about the scale of it, right? 1 in 20 people die in a society. About 90% of the population was affected by hunger or disease. And many of those people survived by selling their land, their whatever, gold, whatever they had. Many of them sold their children. Many of them sold themselves. There was a huge demand, for instance, for sex work, because it was the British and American soldiers were there in the war. So many women sold themselves to be able to eat or to feed their families. These are all kind of stories that we knew growing up, but it's a staggering scale, of what happened. But those people like me, the people who had whose families had either land or had salaried work, kind of an office job, right? Those people were not affected by the famine, and the people who lived in the cities, in any of the Calcutta or the district towns, because the British made sure that there was food in those places to keep the war effort going, to keep the factories running. So they only saw other people come from the countryside begging for food and starving on their sidewalks. They themselves did not face any shortage, right? And so while the famine affected the vast majority of people in Bengal, the small minority of people who subsequently prospered, became educated, became journalists, wrote history books, and so on and so forth, did not get affected by the famine at all. In fact, many of them benefited because they were able to buy up other people's land and other people's people also, oftentimes, for very low prices. That's what I sort of realized when I started going into the stories of the famine. And I mention this because, it was a huge kind of bias that I had, because there's nothing secret about the famine. We all knew, I'd read books about the famine, I'd seen films about it. I knew that it had happened, right? But the reason that I didn't want to look at those photographs or read those testimonies was because I knew that I had spent, all this time writing a book about Calcutta, and I knew that I had not gone and looked for stories of the famine, which were there in plain sight. Right? I could have done it. The question that I kept asking myself was, why didn't you look? What were you doing? And that was not a question I wanted to answer, because to ask that question, like I said, had, involved asking lots of other difficult questions.
Right. So I'm understanding what you're saying, Kushanava, in that it's the idea of, I mean, I don't know why, but I hear the word guilt when you're speaking, a little bit about, oh, maybe I've let myself down. Perhaps I should have done more. Is that because I mean I loved your book, and why
Yeah.
could there be 2 books or 3 books or 5 books? Why is it? What I'm not understanding is why should it be? The famine was a big story, and maybe in some level, if you're writing about your family and their refugees and their story, perhaps is your unconscious bias suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, that perception of people. And why is Kushanava telling us about his family when there's such a ginormous story about so many million people dying in Bengal, which he could have easily researched and told us about instead?
I became very upset when I first read those testimonies because I thought, how come nobody interviewed these people? Even the books that I had read are all sort of secondhand. It's people had read, newspaper accounts or government reports. It's all secondhand, right? How come nobody went and talked to the survivors of the famine? The fact that we have people who literally are still alive who survived the Bengal famine.
And so, what's your learning now when you're talking to these people? What have you learned? Because you're doing the research as we speak.
And so the British expected a full-scale land invasion of India. That was their biggest colony, and so they expected that invasion to happen through the Bay of Bengal and come up through Calcutta. So in that context, they were on a war footing, and what happened to the people of Bengal who were not part of that war effort, right? Who were not working in the factories and the railways, or feeding the soldiers, was, it seems to me, more or less inconsequential to them. The British won the war, but what always struck me as strange about that is also that we have a very robust anti-colonial kind of nationalist history, and if it was only the British who had been responsible for the death of Indians, then why was it not at least told to us as a kind of, something which had happened, which had been done during the colonial period to Indians? And I think one of the reasons is that there was a significant percentage of the population who were in the cities, who were part of the war effort, who were fed, and so, one of the things I realized is that those of us who are today, prospering, are by and large from that part of the population, and so, not only did the famine not affect us, but the people who lived through it also oftentimes were connected, to they were implicated.
So what you're saying really is not just about this whole idea of the Brits were responsible and many million people died, and people have compared it to the Holocaust in Europe, during World War II. And you and I both know that. And yet, what you're suggesting, which is why I'm using that word guilt again, the fact that why are we, those of us of Indian ethnicity, those of us who may have known that history, are we not culpable as well, is the question you're asking or suggesting, in that there were many Bengalis at that time in Calcutta who would have kind of achieved more on the back of sending things for the war effort, and therefore, as a direct result, possibly affecting and increasing those people who died? Or am I putting words in your mouth? But then we all do that, don't we, Kushanava, all over the world. There is always disparity, and there will always be, for want of a better word, the haves and the have-nots. And how do we manage? I mean, here I live in London, and I see people, homeless people on the street. I come back to my lovely, warm, heated house. What does that mean then?
When we were growing up in Calcutta, and you also grew up in Calcutta, you would see people just living on the pavements, their whole families, sleeping on the pavement, cooking on the pavement, the entire sort of household, permanently on the pavement. And there was a sense that these people were sort of, just as if they had just materialized on the pavement, and and so many of those people really were refugees. They had come in waves of exoduses that happened in 47 all the way to the 70s, who had been pushed by the forces of history onto the footpaths of Calcutta, but we didn't see it that way, as even the
What you're
people,
saying really is that growing up, and I completely get that, and we just we take for granted what's around us, or what we see is what it is, and we don't stop and think and question and ask, why are those people on the pavement? What is their story? Can I go and engage and talk to one of them and find out more? That's what you're saying. Tell us
and
more, Kushanava. What else have you learned doing your research and so on that have challenged you, changed you, questioned your unconscious biases?
so I think that I started seeing when you talk about being in London or any of these places. Came back to Delhi. I started seeing all of these people around me who were living. I mean, there are still people living like that. All their belongings are kind of tied up in trees, and they're living, in traffic medians. And I started thinking about the larger force of history that led them to this point in life, right? What is the story, right? How did they end up here? And when you start asking those questions, you start to feel very uncomfortable, because it's not just a question of curiosity. It's that and you don't want to know at some level, just as I didn't want to know
I
the
understand.
stories of the family, because that to truly know will implicate you fear will implicate you in some way. And the other thing that you fear, that I realized, is that you fear that you will have to give up the things that you have once you are implicated in this way. It could be very simply that another person will make demands on you, and then you will be tied up with them, and then they're going to be a nuisance. I mean, that kind of one-on-one. But on a larger scale, it could be that if you truly know, then you, as who you are, what you tell yourself you are when you wake up in the morning, will be severely threatened. That's a big fear. I
That's
mean, fear,
frightening, isn't it?
it's
That's a very
frightening,
scary feeling, yeah.
very scary. It's very scary. And, fear really drives so much of the way in which we operate on a day-to-day basis. You see when I have a child, you see little kids, you tell them, don't be scared, don't be scared, and you think it's sort of the province of children. Fear is the province of, it's not, I mean, we are just not as open about the way in which we're scared, but children are, they cry, or, they're afraid, they tell you, but fear is the driving. I mean, there's desire and there's greed, but really fear, I think, is the thing that is the driving motivation of most of our behavior. From the moment we wake up to the moment.
That's a big thing you've said, and I want to just I want to just talk about that a little bit more, because I want us, me, and of course the listeners, to understand what you're saying. Because they're going to say, what are you talking about, Krishnava? What do you mean fear? I'm not scared. I'm fine. I'm getting on with my life. We don't get what you're saying. I've understood, but I want you to explain it a little bit more. Unknown, right? Because we have no control.
No control, and even the illusion of control looks very ridiculous at that point in time. I mean, we don't really have any control. We have very limited control over our lives anyway. But the story we tell is that, yes, if we do X, Y, and Z,
We're
we
in
will.
charge.
Yeah, we are in charge.
Yeah.
So the illusion of control really fell apart at that time, because we didn't know anything about the virus, right? We didn't know what it was going to do. There was no way to stop it, right? We didn't know how to behave. We didn't know how many people were going to get sick, how many people were going to die, and there was a tremendous fear living in India, I think, that the first places that it hit were really in these rich countries in Europe and America. And so Italy, Spain, the UK, the US. And so looking at the kind of devastation that was happening there, the virus didn't come to India until about June, the first wave hit much later. But it hit here in March. And so you're looking at these countries that have far more resources, that are far wealthier, far more powerful, and they're completely being devastated by this virus. And you think, wow, when it comes here, I mean, it's just going to be mayhem. There's nothing that's going to stop, protect us from this, nothing. And so that is a kind of extra form of terror of just watching other people suffer and being afraid of what is going to happen to you in the future. The other form of fear, of course, is that everything was shut down, as you mentioned, it was a really strict lockdown. So in about 4 hours, they shut down everything, and then you couldn't leave your state, you couldn't leave your city, you couldn't even leave your neighborhood. You were just and so you're stuck, at home. So it's very scary, and
But in that, you've got also the research that you had begun doing before you knew there was something called COVID. You were in India, you were doing research, you've got all these stories you're translating about the survivors of the Great Famine, I'm calling it the Great Famine, but the famine of Bengal. And then suddenly this is happening too. So your fear is exacerbated. Because it's also there. In the United Kingdom, I was locked down in Delhi, but I read when I was sitting in Delhi that in the United Kingdom, people were stockpiling on toilet paper. I mean, everybody had their own fear. And that's what people were doing, just to try and say, I've got control now. I've got 65 rolls of toilet paper in the house and I'll be fine.
Yes, that a virus that is devastating the world will sort of somehow stop at your doorstep and say, okay, you've got 65 rolls of toilet paper. Nothing's gonna, we're not gonna come in here. It's a ridiculous, when you stop and look at it from the outside. It is a ridiculous way in which to feel that you have some kind of control, but it's driven by fear. It's easy to laugh at it.
Sentence though, Kushanava, that you said earlier, the fact that we, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, so forgive me, but that all of us around the world, you and I included, we live our lives actually motivated by fear. Fear is what influences us, motivates us, directs us in all the decisions we make. Pretty much, that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's huge. And I want us to just pause for a moment to understand what that means. Because, so why am I doing this podcast? Why are we having these stories? Why is that motivating me? Is that fear as well then?
I mean, there is an element of fear, I mean, it's very funny. I lived in India for so many years, and and for a variety of reasons, I grew up in the U.S. and then lived in India, and then when I came back, I had left in my 30s, and then I came back when I was about 40, and so there's, I had left when people were sort of in their early careers, and I came back when they're sort of mid-careers, right? And so everybody had enormous amounts of stuff, I mean, it's like, I felt like all these years that I was gone, I mean, people had just been stuffing their basements. It's also funny because in America, you have these basements in people's houses, and in India, there are no basements. And so I would go to somebody's house, and, I would see there are 4 bedrooms or whatever. And then I would go to the basement, and then they have like another house, and where they stockpile like food in bulk for some Armageddon that is coming, even with no pandemic. And the thing that, I would think, all right, so this guy has, 10 times more space than I do. They should be 10 times happier than I am. Or they, are almost all of them, all my friends who were in professional careers were, financially very successful, at least compared to me or compared to anybody who was living, in India. And, I'm a writer. Like this is not the, I have friends who are doctors and computer programmers and all that. And I thought, okay, these guys make 10 times as much money as I do. They should be 10 times as happy. And the universal experience that I had when I came back was people feeling anxious. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, and I just couldn't. I think it really surprised me, And I remember having this conversation with my mom.
This idea of anxiety, is it because we want to prove ourselves? Is that what that's about? That's the fear that's driving us. I want to prove myself. I want to show the world that I've got the metaphorical 65 rolls of toilet paper, or whatever I've got in my basement, and look at me, I've achieved, I've arrived. Is that what happens?
I think there is, but it's like an endless process of arriving. So when I would go to somebody's house and see, their gigantic basement, I think, but you have arrived. I mean, You have definitely arrived. But but then why are you anxious?
You anxious, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having this conversation with my mother about it because I really was perplexed because I had lived away for so long.
But
And
had you sorry to interrupt, but had you visited back during those 10 years? So you were coming in and out. This
yeah,
was
it was about 6
pandemic
years.
time.
I was coming in and out, but then I came to teach here for a semester in 2019, and that's when I was kind of visiting. I think is different from sort of living because then you're
True,
sort of
true.
re-entering a
But at least
society.
you did visit. It wasn't like you hadn't seen the country in 10.
This is what middle age is. You are in this country, like you have accomplished something, and you can see more or less the trajectory of the rest of your life. And you, even if you don't like it, you are too scared to do something different. You're gonna more or less stay on it. And what is driving you is that you have accumulated a few things, in terms of whatever it is, a family, wealth, position. Uh, so you don't want to lose those things, and that's the main fear that you have, right? You don't want to, you don't want to lose those things, and yeah, I think that it really surprised me because it surprised me how widespread it was. There was no threshold at which somebody thought, okay, I'm fine, I've really made it, I'm happy, because the desire for somehow to prove yourself or to sort of keep going, to get ahead, the fear that you will fall behind, um, seems kind of universal. I don't think that even when you become a millionaire or a billionaire, it ends. It's just this kind of,
When does it stop? That's the question, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, the only people, honestly, who I felt were not in that cycle were friends of mine who, for various kinds of disability, like mental illness, were not in the kind of,
Because they wanted to protect themselves from further sort of mental health issues. I imagine that's an instinctive. But then what about you, Kushanava? You're not the hoarder. You haven't got a basement full of things.
it's very difficult. I'm not any different from anybody else. I was just living in a different place. I'm
I mean,
exactly like
now that you're back in the US, you have a kid,
yeah.
and you have a basement, or you don't have a basement?
So I don't have a basement. I don't have a basement, but it's very
Okay, with a
difficult.
metaphorical basement.
Yeah, I don't have a
Are you
metaphorical basement,
collecting? Yeah.
but it is very difficult because I can see. I mean, what I want to, you had asked to talk about the things that that you see about yourself, right? And so
Exactly.
I'm not any different from anybody else. I see exactly how one gets caught up in these kinds of, and the more you get caught up, the more fearful you are because the more you feel that you have to lose. I think that there are a couple of things with that. One is that uh, one is that in this society, I don't know how it is in Britain. I think actually I do know how it is in Britain because I have family there. We don't. None of this really makes any sense if you think about the fact that you and I will be here for a very small amount of time, on this planet. Whatever we do is not of enormous consequence, and so whatever you amass, however many basements, I mean, however many books I write, whatever you do, it's really, I mean, it will be over soon, and all of it will be forgotten, in 50, 100, 500 years. And what is 50, 100, 500 years in the history of even this planet, let alone our universe? I mean, we all know this, but that fact is really hidden from us, because we live in, I mean, this is one of the things I realized, we live in a society where nobody dies. We don't talk about it, we hide it. We don't see people when they die. We send them off to other places, to hospitals and hospices, because if you confront the fact that, if you realize that, you too will soon die, then you start asking questions, this doesn't make any sense, really.
But that shouldn't stop us from being motivated. I mean, you're writing, you're continuing to write, you have a plan.
Yeah,
You've got ambitions, you've got needs, aspirations, not you. I mean, you, me, all of us.
yeah,
And of course, we'll continue to do that. And And you're absolutely right. In X number of years, you will not be on this planet, and I will not be on this planet. And then fast forward a few more years, and you won't even be remembered. Does it actually matter? That's the question you're asking. But that shouldn't stop you from continuing to motivate yourself. So then so what I'm hearing are these two kind of opposites, if you like. One is about fear that rules you and dictates you and influences so many things you do. And then the other hand, you've got the normal stuff, like aspiration and motivation. Are you saying the fear is doing that too?
If we can go back to the pandemic, that experience, when we were so scared. In India, we were so scared, not of what was happening at that time in India. It was of what would happen by observing what was happening in these other countries. Meanwhile, what was happening in India at that time is that because the few of us who had cash and like I had rice reserved, we're fine, and we had high-speed internet, electricity, water, none of that was ever interrupted. But the rest of the population, which is literally was 90% of people, had no income. When they locked down, right? There was they shut down everything, and so the people who worked in the service sector, who worked in people's houses. So in India, I mean, this, but other people, maybe your listeners will know. I mean, that you in people's house, the houses of the wealthy, you have people who come and are nannies and cooks and sweep your floors and do your dishes and drive your cars, and there's a whole battalion of people who are coming into residential neighborhoods of the wealthy. Immediately there was a lockdown. They closed down the neighborhoods. So like in my neighborhood, I lived in Basant Kunj, which is in South Delhi, which are these enormous like apartment complexes, right? Suddenly, thousands of people who worked in these apartment complexes couldn't come in, right? Not only could they not come in, but the salaries that they had been getting, most people stopped paying them because the logic was they're not working. But this extended to all the things, people who sold, things on the roadside, right? People who had shops, all the shops closed. When you put that together, it turns out that, there's some surveys done at Azim Premji University by some people who were friends of mine, the SWAN surveys. 90% of the population were not paid in India in March, in April, and into May. That's when the lockdown took place. And so, people started to starve.
Exactly.
That's what I saw, And so when I say that when I say that the ghosts of the famine were all around me. I remember once,
yeah.
I went to the first story I remember was of a guy who had cycled for 1,700 kilometers. I read that in the second week of the famine. He had cycled for 1,700 kilometers from his factory town in Maharashtra to his village in Orissa, and he had managed to sort of evade all the checkpoints. And he said, listen, I figured that this was going to last 3 months, and if I wasn't paid for 3 months sitting here in this factory town in Maharashtra, I would starve. So I would take my chances, get on a bicycle, right, and try to get home. When I read that story, I thought about the famine because in the famine, people started walking. There's literally wherever they were, they started walking to the nearest town or city because they thought, okay, I may not make it, but at least there.
It happened in India. There were many stories I read at that time of people walking as well. There were no trains. And there were so many immigrants from Bihar and Kerala, for example. And for those of us who don't know the geography, it's many hundreds of thousands of miles between Bihar and Kerala. And those people in Kerala who are from Bihar suddenly had no work. And they were literally trying to get back to their home country so they might have something to eat. And there were many deaths because of that, where they hadn't got COVID yet, but they starved. So I hear you. But then what though, Kushanava? Because how do we live our lives? How do you live your life? Because we're talking here about something that's going to be challenging all the listeners. Certainly is making me think and will continue to make me think, because you're so right. You said that in the beginning. We create our own reality. I mean, we create our own stories and we live our lives to the best way we can, because we've got to get up in the morning and do our stuff, whatever that is. But if we stop for a minute and think about what you've just said. It is really frightening. Um, so what do we do? How do you manage your day-to-day level? Just your life of living and being happy and motivated and so on.
Well, I think that, at the time, the the first thing was to see it. I mean, it was, I think I was able to see it a little bit earlier because I was looking at it through the eyes of the family. Um, but and you were right that these kinds of things happen. You encounter it in your day-to-day life, living in any big city in India, in America, or in Europe, or anywhere in the world. But at that time, it was writ large. It was a mass phenomenon. If you think about it, it was actually bigger than the famine because in India there's 1.3 billion people, right? And about 10% of those people had migrated to cities, and this affected so maybe 120 million people. We don't know, 120, 130 million people, and most of those people were affected because most of them stopped getting paid. Right? We were the very small minority, like me, my friends who were working in media or in government or businesses. They were the only people, again, like the famine, who were not affected. Everybody else was affected. I mean, I started asking these questions about, so when the stories broke of people walking home, as you were describing, literally walking home because of no trains and no buses, um, the media was covering it as a migrant crisis. And I started thinking that, I'm a migrant, right? I'm not from Delhi. I wasn't born and raised. What would have caused me to sort of, like start walking, right? And I sort of thought about it, when I kept asking people this question, like, why would you walk? And then the thing I realized is that the people who were walking, they couldn't pay rent. They were afraid they would lose their houses. They didn't have food. There was some rationing happening, but maybe you would get rice, but what would you eat the rice with? Or you would get flour, but you'd make, bread with it, but what would you eat the bread with? And even that wasn't often enough. There was no milk for children. And so they were literally starving at home, right? And so if I felt that I would literally starve to death in an unfamiliar place, and my chances of survival were better if I had somehow made it home, I would start walking. I think the thing that made me realize was that it wasn't that they were migrants or that they were poor or somehow that they were marginal to the experience. Actually, I was marginal to the experience. I was one of the few people who was completely unaffected. The price of rice did not go up. There was no inflation. Nothing happened. I was completely fine. That I was one of the few people who was unaffected, but that there was no difference between me and those people. There was no such thing as me and it would have been me. When partition happened, it was people like my grandparents.
Exactly.
When you see the people in from the Rohingya or the Syrians on TV, they're people just like you, living in a society that has kind of come apart. And there was no difference. It wasn't that they were like me. I mean, there was literally there's no difference. And then I started thinking, like, what is this? Not only was there no difference, but Kerala, you mentioned, is a very important case because at that time I had friends, a lot of Bengalis working in Kerala, and the situation in Kerala was very different than in other parts of India because there was a lot of coordinated effort by the state and by civil society to provide protection to these migrant workers. About a tenth of that society's migrant workers, 3 or 4 million people. Like I have friends who said, the police would come to our door and say, "Do you need food?" They say, "Okay, if you don't have food, we will give you rations." Like the police, but the local police. They would call the landlords, and say, "Listen, you are not allowed." And in front of the tenants say, "You're not allowed to evict anybody who can't pay rent for the next 3 months. And if anybody tries to evict you, then come to the police station, and we will prevent you from being evicted." They set up mass kitchens, right? Where in parks and where people could be fed. Oftentimes, where they could be fed the food that is culturally theirs, right? Like Bengali and Bihar have a different diet, than people in Kerala. They did a lot of things to make sure that there wasn't a major humanitarian crisis at that time, And so I started thinking, like, what is this? Who am I, right, in this? that requires so many people to suffer so much, right? And I understood the fear that we were afraid. You know, I understood even the people who didn't pay the people working for them. If you're not getting paid, that means somebody's not paying you. Well, who's not paying you? Oftentimes the people who themselves are getting paid were not paying, and they weren't paying because they were scared, because they thought, okay, if COVID comes, what's going to happen? I don't know. But I really started to see the cost of me being me in that situation. And I thought, okay, what if you give this up? What is the what's going to happen? We were living in these places which had enormous empty parks. All the parks had been closed because of COVID. You could have just housed people in these places. We all had cash. I mean, I was part of efforts among friends to provide food. It cost, at that time, a family of 4 could be fed for 1,500 rupees a month, which is like $20. I mean, it's not even any money in India, really. If you have a job, if you're getting a salary, 1,500 rupees a month is nothing. That's what it costs. So I started seeing the real wages of me being me. Yeah, and I thought there's no reason to live like that, to live with that kind of fear.
But then what do you do now, though, Kushanava? Because you've got that realization. So how are you managing? What are you doing on a daily basis?
Right now I'm still writing this book. But I think that and not trying to accumulate, basements, it's very difficult to remember. But I think that what I'm trying to do is to stay connected to that experience. I think I mentioned to you when we spoke before that when all this happened, I was writing a book about Kerala. It was going to be ostensibly a book about what happened in Kerala in the 20th century. And in Kerala, like until the 1850s, it was a slave society. Like 1 in 7 people was a slave. Agriculture was done by slaves, and those people were, not only slaves, but they were untouchable and unseeable. So the slavery in Kerala was much worse than what we know, for instance, in the U.S., because the slave could also not literally had to be invisible to the slave owner. And even 100 years ago, it was like that. And you would lose caste if you literally touched or oftentimes physically saw another person.
That's right.
And I remember there are these stories of community feasting that happened. In 1917, there was a guy, Sodharan Ayappan, who used to do community feasts. What he did was simply he would invite people of different castes to sit and eat together. Now, that was a terrifying prospect at that time, because the idea was if you ate with somebody, you would lose your caste. If you lost your caste, then you would become nobody, right? Ontologically, you would just disappear. Now we think of that and it sounds hilarious, or it sounds ridiculous, right? Like, what would you lose if you just ate with somebody or touched somebody? But that's what people thought at that time, right? And one of the things I realized about I'd gone to the place where Ayappan was from, which is near where the Periyar River meets the sea. And those places, they used to flood every year in the monsoons. And so when they would flood, people would sort of gather in somebody's attic, with the animals and everything, the field workers, people of different castes would all basically go into somebody's attic. And for that time, they would eat together and they would share water. There was no prohibitions, right? And I think, even though I don't know for sure, I think that must have been what gave Ayappan the idea that, if you can do this in a time of crisis, why can't you do it all the time, right? And I think COVID is a kind of, that experience was kind of like a flood, right? It was an emergency.
Yeah. Where we all come together.
Yeah,
we all should come together.
Yeah, there's no difference between us. There's no difference. And so that, the next logical step is to say, well, this is how we should, we should be all the time. It's very scary. But once you break out of it, I think when you look at it in retrospect, it seems like nothing at all.
I think what you're saying, really, for me to try and understand and summarize is, I think all of us, certainly anywhere in the world, we're influenced, we're motivated by fear. And of course, we know the reasons why that happened for you to come to that realization. But what we can do, very simply put, is just be more inclusive in our approach of everything that we do. More accepting, more not living in our little silos. Whether it's our basements full of things or whether it's attitudes towards people, race, democracy, caste, it doesn't matter. It's really for us to try and accept the world that we're in a more holistic way. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that.
There's only one world. I mean, we're all living in one world, and we are vast. I think that is the thing that, this, I'll tell you another experience that I had in Kerala, which is that in the early 20th century, there was this social reformer that is little known about outside of Kerala, but is sort of universally regarded, Sri Narayana Guru, and Narayana Guru was he was an anti-caste reformer. He was an ascetic, but he came from an untouchable caste. And so one of the things he did for a while was people who were excluded from the temples would ask him to consecrate temples to deities. And so he did that for a while, even though he did not worship any deities. So after a while, he got tired of it. And he said, okay, we should have schools. People need to get educated. We should have schools, libraries. We don't need to have, more temples with deities. But people kept asking him. So there's a place south of Kochi in Cherthala where these guys came and asked him and they wouldn't take no for an answer. So he said, okay. And he consecrated a mirror. Just literally,
mirror. I've understood
a mirror. A mirror. So you go in and if you go into a religious place hoping that, to worship somebody, and then you encounter yourself, right? I mean, it is a terrifying thing to have that happen to you. So when I went there, the authorities at some point had put a deity in front of the mirror, right? And I could completely understand why, because nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to go in and look at themselves and see the vastness of who
you are.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to stop there because I think that's a brilliant way to end. Lots for us to think about. The listeners are going to go away with their minds, well, as mine is. Lots to think about, Kushanava, really. Kushanava Choudhury, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Stories Seldom Told. I am Smitha Tharoor. It is you, the listener, that makes this podcast what it is. If you like this podcast, please do share. If any of you anywhere in the world feel that you have stories to share, please do connect with me on social media at Smitha Tharoor on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or on my company page, Tharoor Associates, on Facebook. We will be back next week.